You bury someone once. You say goodbye once. You close the lid, lower the box, and walk away, and that's supposed to be the end of it. But for most of human history, that was only half the funeral. In dozens of ancient cultures, spread across continents that never once made contact with each other, people dug their dead back up, not out of horror, not out of grief gone wrong, on purpose, as a plan. As a second, separate ceremony that mattered just as much as the first one, sometimes more. They called it, in one form or another, the second death. And understanding why they did it tells you something uncomfortable about what a body actually means to the people who loved it. Start with the practical version, the one anthropologists can point to in the ground itself. Across Neolithic Europe, in long barrows and chambered tombs dating back 7,000 years, archaeologists keep finding the same strange pattern. Bones, but no bodies. Skulls stacked separately from leg bones. Ribs sorted into piles. Someone had opened these graves long after burial, after the flesh was gone, and rearranged what was left. For a while, some researchers assumed looting, but looters don't sort. Looters grab and go. What was happening here was something closer to housekeeping for the dead. A first burial to let the body do its work, quietly, underground, out of sight, while the flesh returned to soil. And then, months or years later, a second visit. A second ceremony. The bones lifted out, cleaned, and moved somewhere new. A communal ossuary, a shared chamber, a place where the person stopped being an individual corpse and became something else. An ancestor. That word matters more than it sounds like it should. An ancestor isn't just a dead relative. An ancestor is a dead relative who has been processed, socially and physically, into a new category. Someone who can now be prayed to, consulted, honored at festivals, folded into the identity of the living family instead of just missing from it. You can still watch a version of this happen today. In highland Madagascar, the Merina and Betsileo peoples practice Famadihana, literally, the turning of the bones. Every 5 to 7 years, a family opens the family tomb, lifts out the wrapped remains of relatives who died since the last ceremony, and dances with them. Fresh silk shrouds, music, food, grandchildren carrying the bones of a great-grandmother they never met in life, introducing her, almost literally, to the newest members of the family. Anthropologist Maurice Bloch, who spent decades studying Merina funerary practice, described the first burial as provisional and almost apologetic, a temporary holding position, not a true resting place. The real farewell, the one that counts, comes later, once the body has had time to become something you can hold without flinching, and once the family has had time to become ready to let go. That timing detail shows up again and again on the other side of the planet, among the Dayak peoples of Borneo, in a ritual anthropologist Robert Hertz analyzed in a foundational 1907 study on the two-stage nature of death. Hertz noticed something the earlier primitive superstition explanations had completely missed. The two burials weren't really about the corpse at all. They were tracking 3 things moving in parallel, at the same speed. The body decomposing. The soul, believed to be lingering nearby, unsettled, not yet fully departed. And the family's grief, raw and disorganized at first. When all 3 finally finished their work, flesh gone, soul released, grief settled into something bearable. That's when the second funeral happened, not on a fixed calendar, on the calendar of decomposition itself, which means the first burial was never meant to be a farewell. It was a waiting room. This reframes something you might get wrong about ancient death rituals if you only ever picture solemn, single-ceremony burials, the kind modern funerals rehearse. Some of the most emotionally elaborate death rituals in history weren't built around loss. They were built around delay, around refusing to let one moment of grief be the whole story. Here's the part that should feel closer to home than it seems. You already understand this instinct, even if you've never buried and reburied anyone. Think about how you actually process losing something enormous, a relationship, a job, a version of yourself. The first reaction rarely holds up. It's too raw, too immediate, too tangled up with shock to mean anything permanent. The real understanding, the version you can actually live with, comes later. After time has done to the memory roughly what soil does to a body, stripped away the parts that were too painful to look at directly, and left something you can finally hold. Ancient societies built an entire ritual architecture around a truth modern grief culture mostly ignores, that one funeral is rarely enough. that a single day of mourning is being asked to do a job that actually takes years. Researchers studying grief and ritual timing, including work referenced in death studies literature on staged mourning, have noted that cultures with multi-stage funerary practices often report clearer, more socially supported paths through grief than cultures that expect closure in a single ceremony. There's also a colder, more structural reason the second burial mattered so much, one that has nothing to do with emotion at all. In many of these societies, a person wasn't considered fully, socially dead until the second ceremony happened. Their property couldn't be redistributed, their spouse couldn't remarry. Their position in the family hierarchy stayed technically occupied, frozen, until the bones came up clean and the community agreed, now they are gone. Death, in other words, wasn't a moment. It was a process with a beginning and an end, and the beginning, that first burial, was never the end of anything. It was the start of the paperwork. You see the same architecture, built independently, thousands of miles from Borneo or Madagascar in the ancient Mediterranean. Classical archaeologists have documented ossilegium, the Roman practice of gathering a cremated person's bones from the pyre days after the fire had done its work, washing them in wine, and placing them in a separate urn for permanent burial. A second, deliberate stage layered on top of the first. Go further back, into the Bronze Age burial caves of the southern Levant, and you find collective ossuaries packed with bones from individuals originally interred elsewhere, moved there once the flesh was gone, exactly the pattern researchers see in Neolithic Europe and highland Madagascar alike. 3 regions, 3 unrelated belief systems. The same 2-step choreography arrived at separately, again and again. That repetition is the detail worth sitting with. This isn't one culture's odd custom that happened to survive in the historical record. It's a pattern that keeps reinventing itself, independently, everywhere humans have had time to think seriously about what a body becomes after the person is gone. When something shows up that consistently across unconnected societies, anthropologists tend to treat it less like a cultural quirk and more like a solution, a repeated answer to a problem every grieving community eventually runs into. Now here's where the comparison gets a little uncomfortable. You live inside a culture that has mostly abandoned this. One funeral, 1 week of casseroles delivered by neighbors, one expectation that you should be getting back to normal by the time everyone else has moved on with their lives. Bereavement leave in most modern workplaces runs 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days to complete a process that Bronze Age communities gave years. And maybe that's why so many people describe grief as something that ambushes them again months later, at a moment that seems to make no sense. A random Tuesday, a familiar smell, a season changing, an anniversary nobody else remembers. Grief counselors call this delayed grief or a grief spike, almost always describing it as abnormal, something to be managed or medicated back into a straight line. But look at it next to Famadihana, next to Hertz's Dayak funerals, and it stops looking abnormal at all. It looks exactly like what every one of these ancient rituals assumed would happen by default. That mourning doesn't arrive once and finish. It arrives in waves, on its own timeline, and the first wave is never the last one. Modern grief has no second ceremony to catch that later wave when it comes. Ancient grief was built with one already waiting. It's not that the grief was wrong the first time. It's that one ceremony was always going to be too small a container for something this large. Ancient families didn't need a psychological framework to figure that out. They just watched their own grief closely enough, generation after generation, to notice it never behaved like a single event, and they built their rituals to match reality instead of forcing reality to match a tidy, one-day ceremony. The people who dug their families back up understood that better than modern grief culture tends to. They weren't disturbing the dead. They were finishing something the first burial had only started, giving grief the second act it actually needed, and giving the person they lost a chance to become, at last, something the family could carry instead of something they had to bury and forget. You bury someone once. But maybe the truer ending was never that simple. Maybe it never fully ends in a single day at all.